in a little series on the book of Acts, Lessons from the Early Church. And we turn our attention to not a really happy subject this morning, but it is undoubtedly probably one of the more significant subjects in the experience of Christians, maybe not in this country, but in most of the countries of the world, and certainly in church history. And that is the subject of what to do when the rules of men run contrary to the rules of God. What to do when the rule of men runs contrary to the rule of God. The technical title, I guess, for this subject is the whole subject of civil disobedience. What's involved in, when there's a conflict between what God expects from us and what government requires from us. I would like to start by saying that I don't think that civil disobedience is a new thing in our society. In fact, the people that were sent over from England in the 1620s, 30s, and 40s that were the first European and the most enduring European settlers were people that were fleeing for their lives from tyranny in Britain. The Church of England at that time was persecuting nonconformists and Baptists and Brethren groups, Plymouth Brethren, and any other type of independent. And those people were, many of them were killed. People were burned at the stake in the 1600s in England for religious diversity of opinion from what the people and the government believed. And so this country was, in large measure, at least south of the border, was settled by people who knew all about civil disobedience. Even though we don't know much about it today, I think that now is the time to be preparing for it. I think the handwriting is on the wall. I have no intention of being a pessimist this morning. I'm not a pessimist. I feel that I'm a realist. And tremendous changes have taken place in our society in the last 50 years. And we need to be understanding what is involved about the Christian's responsibility to government and to God when these are in conflict. There are many similarities, I believe, that exist between the first century church that we are studying here in the book of Acts and the churches in the 20th century. For example, at this very minute, down in Mexico and in Nicaragua, Christians are being persecuted very overtly by the Roman Catholic hierarchy and by the government that is strongly influenced by the Roman Catholic system. It has only been in the last 5 years in the communist satellite countries known as the Warsaw Pact countries and Russia itself, in the Soviet Union, that Christians have gained the freedom to meet and to gather unmolested. Friday night we took the young people into Bethel to listen to Rob Lindstedt, a Bible teacher and evangelist from Wichita, Kansas, and he shared how that last summer he took a group of 37 people to Russia and they distributed Bibles and tracts. And he said they were followed all over by 2 KGB men last summer. Nothing came of it. They weren't persecuted. In fact, they had phenomenal freedoms. They went to Gorky, which is formerly a prohibited city for Western foreigners, and they had the help of the military police distributing Bibles, giving out literature, preaching in public squares, preaching in schools, giving out literature in government buildings to the KGB. These people they have more freedoms over there at the moment than we do in this country. More religious freedom in that country now than we do in this country. But he said the fellow that was instrumental in providing them Bibles for their whole enterprise, I don't know how many weeks they spent over there, was a man that had spent I think starting at 19 years of age, he spent 7 years in Siberia, or 6 years in Siberia, persecuted by the regime for his Christianity. And after he came back, he went back to university, and they took him out of university and forbade him from continuing his education because he was a Christian and not silent for his faith. These are illustrations of the reality, the ongoing reality that even though it's not true for us yet, I believe we are an anomaly. We are an exception to the rule. Very few Christians down through the centuries have ever lived without persecution, overt persecution by the ruling civil authorities. Now, when you read the New Testament, it's impossible to read it without seeing it, isn't it? We've been in Acts chapters 3 and 4 for the last couple of weeks. I want to go back through these two chapters, 4 and 5 this morning. I want to focus on 3 things, or 4 things. What causes a situation where civil government opposes, overtly persecutes Christians who are peace-loving people and who simply want to stand for truth and who want to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ so that other people can be saved? What creates a situation when government persecutes people like us? Secondly, what not only causes it, but what characterizes it? What are the key elements? And that's not a very difficult question to answer. How do you know when you're in a situation like that? It's pretty obvious. And thirdly, what should a Christian do? What is the Christian response in such a situation where God's laws seem to be in conflict with the laws of the government that are running the place that you live in? And fourthly, what can we as Christians expect from God when we find ourselves in such a situation? Let's look at these 4 questions this morning. This is a topical study, and so we're not going to be exegeting verses in order, but we will be jumping around a little bit. I think it's an appropriate subject. I really do. I have in my Bible this morning a pamphlet that I read with very much interest about 15 years ago when I was in college, written by Pastor Richard Wurmbrand, who some of you will recognize as a Romanian pastor who spent many years of his life in solitary confinement as a Christian. And he's still alive, I understand, and his base is in southern Ontario now, in St. Thomas. All right? This man went through it in our lifetime in the communist countries, and he's written a little book entitled Preparing for the Underground Church. His advice is to Western Christians, smarten up. The handwriting's on the wall. You need to prepare yourself. When civil persecution of Christians actually begins, that's a very poor time to begin preparing to stand for your faith. Now is the time. And in our country, in the last 10 years, we have lost the right to pray in certain places of our society. The symbols of Christianity are being kicked out of public life. The next thing, of course, is going to be the real stuff. Not just the symbols, not just the token prayers, not just the reading of the Bible in schools, but it's going to be persecution of anybody that insists on teaching children. What do you do when a government like ours has publicly declared that it's illegal to say anything against homosexuality? I just broke the law because I think homosexuality is a sin, according to the Bible. And our government has said it's illegal to say that now. The handwriting's on the wall. This is no longer a Christian community. It's no longer a Christian country. And it won't be too long, I believe, until overt persecution of Christians is going to begin in this country, if the pattern continues. What causes this to happen? Let's look for the answers in God's Word this morning in Acts chapters 4 and 5. Before this ever happened, and this is about probably 1 or 2 years, or maybe within the first year after Jesus went back to glory and left his apostles down here, empowered by the Holy Spirit to start churches and to preach the gospel, the very day or two before Jesus left, or before he was crucified, he predicted in John chapter 16 the events that shortly unfolded after his departure. So to understand what's happening here, we have to read Acts chapter 16, just a couple of verses. Verses 1 to 6. Jesus said, "These things have I spoken unto you," and he was talking to his own followers in a private room in Jerusalem. He says, "I have said this to you that you should not be offended. They shall put you out of the synagogues. Yea, the time cometh that whosoever killeth you will think that he doeth God's service. And these things will they do unto you, because they have not known the Father nor me. But these things have I told you, that when the time shall come you may remember that I told you of them. And these things I did not say unto you at the beginning, because I was with you. But now I go my way to him that sent me, and none of you asked me, where are you going? But because I have said these things to you, sorrow hath filled your heart." Back up to chapter 15, verse 18. Jesus said to these same people, "If the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. But because you are not of the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word that I said unto you, the servant is not greater than his Lord. If they have persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they have kept my saying, they will keep yours also. But all these things will they do unto you for my name's sake, because they do not know him that sent me." Jesus predicted that persecution was going to come on his followers. The only adequate explanation for why civil government would persecute peace-loving people that believe in right and wrong and have no bones to pick with government per se. In fact, we are instructed to pray for government and to honor government and to support government and pay our taxes without belly aching. We Christians of all people should never come under the ire and opposition of the government. But it happens. Why? Ultimately, because God said it would happen. This is part of the sovereign plan. This is no accident. This is the way it has always been, and Jesus predicted it would continue. Divine sovereignty at the root is the cause of such a situation when Christians should be persecuted by civil authority. But I think if we come to Acts chapters 4 and 5, you will see that in the outworking of God's infinite plan, in bringing things to be, we see here a polarized society. I went through Acts chapter 5 this morning, and I was listing the little word "all." There are a dozen or so, about a dozen references to what kind of a society the apostles lived in here in Acts chapter 5, in Acts chapter 4. It says in verse 11 that all these Christians, all the people, had a great respect, a great fear, a great reverence for God in the early church. Nobody was excluded. So you have a very devout group of people. It's not like it is today. The average local church probably has 20% of really committed people. Maybe a better word to use is surrendered, right? But many people are just church attenders. It's churchianity for many people today. It's impossible for me to tell what percentage in this church. But when the chips are down, which of you really has a respect for God? Really has a fear for Jehovah? Everybody in the first church did. I mean, it was no little thing to belong to that first church. All the Christians had a fear of God. All the Christians were genuine. Verses 13 and 14, it actually says that of the rest of the people, no man dared join himself to these Christians, but the people magnified them. The believers were the more added to the Lord, multitudes both of men and women. In the early church, it was a very black and white thing. Everybody knew who the Christians were. There was no question. It was a black and white line of demarcation. That's a Christian. That guy isn't. Right? And everybody saw this, and everybody was really watching these Christians, but people just didn't join the Christians in those days. We've explained why before. But when a person became a believer, then it says they were added to the Lord, and they were men and women being multiplied, being added to the church. When a person became a believer, it was genuine in those days. Verse 17. It wasn't just a little problem that the apostles and early Christians had with the civil authority. Look at verse 17. Then the high priest rose up, and all that were with him, which is the sect of the Sadducees, and were filled with indignation. I said, what is the reason for persecution of Christians by the civil authority? Well, the reason is because you have a polarized society. You have these despicable Christians over here. You have a large watching mass of people over here, and then the people in authority, all of them were committed to an anti-Christian philosophy. It says the high priest and all that were with him, not some, all, right? We're talking about a polarized, a very supercharged situation here. You know, and I've been a Christian since I was 7 years of age. And it wasn't until I was in my teens that I started to read the news, and really become aware of my circumstances, right? But I've noticed, I think I've noticed, that society seems to be becoming more polarized just in my lifetime. Just in my lifetime. Right? When I was a kid, you didn't hear about the homosexual lobby. Right? You didn't hear about all these minority people fighting for their rights. You just didn't have that. Right? And what we have today is that the fragmentation of our society into little groups, interest groups, all right? And the Christians are being shoved over here, right? And that's a sign, that's a bad sign. It really is. Bad in the sense, in terms of the status quo and peace, right? Maybe it's good for us and good for the cause of Christ. We don't have time to go through all of this morning, but there are a dozen other things that indicate that there was the little isolations within the first century society. All right, so I think there are three real reasons, in addition to what we've already said this morning, as to why civil government would actually come to a place where they would actually persecute Christians. And listen very carefully now, because this is where, this is the meat of it here, I think. Number one, the first century church was a very successful group. The first century church had many successes. In chapter 2, verse 41, it says that 3,000 people were saved. There were 3,000 converts the very first day that the church began. In verse 47, it says that it wasn't really a despicable group in the eyes of society, but there was lots of grassroots support for these people. 2:47, praising God and having favor with all the people. We're talking about the Jewish populace here. We're not talking about the leadership, we're talking about the populace. The average person in the street looked at these Christians, and maybe they weren't willing to join them, but they weren't against them either. Right? Grassroots support. Now, if there's anything that a politician wants, it's grassroots support, right? Sure. These Christians had it. And that was one of the reasons why the government came down on them. One of the contributing factors. 3,000 converts the first day, grassroots support. 5,000 converts the next day or the day after. It says in chapter 4, verse 4, many people who heard Peter preach believed, and the number of the people was about 5,000. The number of the men was about 5,000. So we've got at least 8,000 instantaneous converts in this city within a week's time. Large grassroots support. We come to chapter 4, verses 14 and 15 and 16, when they hauled Peter and John into the courtroom, and they start interrogating these men. They couldn't deny that a great miracle had been done. We have it from their own lips. These leaders marveled at Peter and John. They took knowledge of them that they had been with Jesus. And beholding the man who was healed standing with them, they could say nothing against it. You know, if there's one thing that the world doesn't like, but it can't do anything about, it's the fact that your life is radically changed. That this person's life is radically changed. That person's life is radically changed. This man's life was radically changed. They didn't like it, but they couldn't do anything about it, right? Christian success. Every time a person gets saved and their life is transformed, that's a testimony. Chalk that up, one more for the Christians. All right? And when that starts happening, that is one of the things that sort of precipitates opposition. Chapter 5, verse 14, it says that as the days progressed, more people were added. Multitudes, both of men and women. This wasn't just a fly-by-night thing. It was obviously a growing movement. And on the one hand, Christian success. On the other hand, bold Christian leadership. These guys weren't about to be cowed. They weren't just half committed. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a movement without leadership. It wasn't just a popular movement, but it was a movement that had the great potential of really burgeoning, because the men were no slouches that were leading this thing. And you can read it. Chapter 4, verse 13, these men saw the leadership of Peter and John. They were unlearned and ignorant men, but they marveled. That, to me, that's a very humorous situation. I wish I was a movie director. I'd love to put this on, make a movie up about it. Because these highfalutin, power-wielding individuals in the Jewish court, who were the civil authorities of their day, and by the way, between 6 AD and 66 AD, the Jewish Sanhedrin never had so much power. They were composed of up to 71 men, and these men were given the privilege by the Roman government of controlling all aspects of civil life. All aspects of civil life. The only thing they could not do was carry out a capital decision. They couldn't put somebody to death. They had to get the Romans had to okay that. All right? And the Romans, in addition, had reserved the right to intervene at any point in their judicial process as civil government, which they did. There's a couple of examples in else places in the book of Acts that they did so. But these people wielded real power. Right? And yet these rich dudes, the Sadducees were rich and powerful. When they came in contact with Peter and John, these just ordinary, humble fishermen whose lives were transformed by Jesus Christ, filled with the Holy Spirit, they were no match for these guys. They were astonished. They were amazed. They were trying to deny, these rich dudes were trying to deny the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which was the very message that these men were preaching. And they took one look at them and they realized there's a living Christ here. That's what it says. They took knowledge of that they had been with Jesus. Uh-oh, something's not quite right here, right? You can just put yourself in the position of these guys. Bold Christian leadership. Look at chapter 4, verse 29. Peter and John come back to the Christians and they pray, Lord, behold their threatenings. Grant to your servants that with all boldness they may preach your word. And it says in verse 31 that they got it. They got the Spirit and they got the boldness. Verse 33, they had great power in preaching. Chapter 5, verse 15 says that they had so much power in these early days that it describes it, insomuch that the sick people, brought the sick into the streets and laid them on beds and couches, that at least the shadow of Peter passing by might overshadow some of them. I don't know what to make of that. I don't know anybody like that today. And I don't think we should expect people to have that kind of power today. I think this was limited to the apostolic era. That the apostles themselves, that first generation of men that were responsible for starting out the church system under Christ's absent leadership, were especially empowered to do this sort of stuff, so that their claims and their messages would have obvious divine authentication that these people really do have the truth. And since then, the whole New Testament has been written. We don't need that additional power. I believe the power is still there, the Holy Spirit's power to change life, to answer prayer, to heal. That's all there today, still. Right? I think some of these other special gifts are passed, but the point is that these men demonstrated real power. There's no question. This is not just a little movement, it's a big movement. Lots of people, powerful leaders. And so the next thing that explains why the government in the first century persecuted the Christians is that the civil government began to be afraid. They began to be jealous. They began to get angry at a situation they couldn't change. And you read, I'd like you to see it. This is Christian psychology this morning, chapter 4, verse 2. Why did they come and grab Peter and throw him in jail? It says, being grieved that they taught the people, being troubled that they taught the people and preached through Jesus the resurrection from the dead. They were angry at what they were preaching. Now, I'll tell you right now that this is something that is growing in our society. There is growing anger at the stubborn insistence of Bible-believing Christians to believe in miracles, to believe in the Trinity, to believe in God, to believe in the future, to believe in the Bible. A lot of people in our society are very irate at fanatics like you and me. They don't like it at all. They really are upset. The New Age people have actually written it and said that the only hope for peace on this planet is to kill the Christians and the Jews. In so many words. Because they're the fanatics. They're the stumbling blocks to human progress. And that mentality is growing in our society. This is what it was like then, in the first century. They didn't like what they heard. Right? Verse 7. And when they had set these men in the midst, this is the jurors on the Sanhedrin, when they had set Peter and John in the midst of the council, they asked, by what power or by what name have you done this stuff? Why are you preaching? Why are you creating turmoil in our society? You know what this tells me? They're concerned about authority here. They're concerned about power. I believe that they felt insecure. Even though they had authority, their authority was being challenged. They recognized that there's power in this movement, and it's like it's either you or me, buddy, right? And they saw this black and white before Jesus Christ was even put to death. Caiaphas stood up one day. I believe it was Caiaphas or Annas in John chapter 12. And they had a little tete-a-tete with the bigwigs in the Sanhedrin, and they said, hey, we can't let this guy keep going, talking about Jesus, because if we do, then the Romans are going to come and they're going to take away our power. They were very insecure leaders. And that's another reason why they persecuted these Christians. In their minds, they had to destroy this opposition, destroy this threat. Verse 16 of chapter 4. They took one look at Peter and John. They knew there was a miracle, and they said, what shall we do to these men? For that indeed a notable miracle hath been done by them as manifest to all those who dwell in Jerusalem. We cannot deny it. They had to make a decision. It was the hour of decision for the Sanhedrin. They were at the point of no return. It's either let the Christians take over society or we stop them. Right? Everybody knows about this. Everybody knows. So they were undecided. They had to make a decision, and nobody likes making it. Everybody here like making big decisions in your life? It's usually a traumatic affair, right? It's pretty tough. Verse 17, they went on to say, but in order that it spread no further among the people, let us threaten them that they speak henceforth to no man in his name. They were afraid that this movement would just get out of control. And indeed it did. Chapter 5, verse 24. If we come over to the next episode in the book of Acts. And remember what had happened in Acts chapter 5? The Sanhedrin finally had enough, and they said, we're going to throw these guys in jail. They put all the apostles in jail, not just Peter and John, but all of them. And they said, we're going to keep them there overnight. In the morning we're going to bring them to court, and we're going to settle this thing once and for all. Well, they didn't realize that they were having to reckon with the power of God. God sent his angel. The angel let them out of the jail and then locked the jail back up and said, go stand in the temple and preach. So in the morning, oh, we got a great jail here, but where's the prisoners? That's in effect what happened. And so they sent a detail to pick them up. These guys came back, and they said, we didn't find them in jail. We found them in the temple preaching. Look at what it says in verse 25. Or 24. Now when the high priest and the captain of the temple and the chief priests heard these things, they were perplexed concerning them how this would grow. You know what that tells me? It wasn't that they were really amazed that somebody could escape from jail. What they were afraid is that this story was going to spread like wildfire, how it would grow through the city. You know? This is one of the contributing factors in the minds of the civil authorities. They were angry at what these people were preaching. They were insecure themselves. They were undecided of what to do. They were afraid of a spreading movement. They recognized they had lost the popular support. In chapter 4, verse 21, it says that even when they arrested these men, what did they have to do? They had to handle them with kid gloves, right? It says that twice in these two chapters. When they had further threatened them, they let them go, finding nothing how they might punish them because of the people. Because of the people. They had lost popular support. They were afraid of losing more. Look at 5:17. Then the high priest rose up and all that were with him, which is the sect of the Sadducees, and were filled with indignation. My footnote in my Bible says, my marginal note, says this is jealousy. They were jealous. 5:28. When they finally got these guys in the council, what did they say to them? Did we not strictly command you that you should not teach in this name? And behold, you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching, and you intend to bring this man's blood upon us. Wait a sec. Wait a sec. Isn't this exactly what had happened about 2 or 3 weeks earlier? Maybe not 2 or 3 weeks. Jesus was alive for 40 days, and this is another 10 or 15 or 20 days. So we're talking about a month ago or a month and a half ago, right? 5 or 6 weeks before this event, these men were all at the foot of the judgment seat, hollering out to Pilate, "His blood be upon us and upon our children." They said that, these very men. And now, 5 weeks later, they got short memories. They're telling these apostles, "You're trying to make us look bad. You're trying to make it look like we put that we're some kind of horrible people." That's what they were afraid of. They were afraid of being made a scapegoat. They were afraid of being made to look bad. And I think that the thing that really touched it off, the real reason for persecution of Christians in a society like this is pure conviction. When they heard Peter stand up and speak back to them at the council, it says they were cut to the heart. Then they took counsel to slay them. Cut to the heart. When a person is convicted, they're either going to do one of two things, right? They're going to say, "I agree with you, I'm wrong, you're right," or they're going to get mad. They're going to try to chop your head off, right? Make you look bad, right? Hurt you in retaliation. And that's the way it turned out. In the first century, fear and jealousy were probably and conviction were probably the prime motivators for the persecution of the Christians by the civil authorities. Later on, under Diocletian and Nero and Galerius, 3 or 4 of the other Roman emperors down the road, 20 or 30 years from this event, it wasn't so much fear and jealousy of the Christians as it was that they were looking for a scapegoat for their own mismanagement. There's a whole variety of explanations as to why civil government would turn around and persecute peace-loving people like Christians, who are good for society. We're the salt of the earth. If it wasn't for us, things would be really bad in this country. If it wasn't for what we believed, our country would be maybe like the Soviet Union. And in 70 years, who knows, this country might be just as bad off as the present-day Soviet Union is. Right? Because they've adopted the same principles, right? No God, right? Don't teach your kids about God, and all that kind of stuff. Right? Our society has adopted those atheistic principles, and we're going to pay down the road. We see it in the Soviet Union today. What I'm saying is that what causes this? Well, we've given you a bunch of reasons this morning. I think in the future, perhaps in our lifetime, will come to pass some of the predictions that Christ and the apostles made as to why God's people, believers, are going to be persecuted. And I think ultimately it's going to boil down to the fact that Satan knows his time is short. He hates God. He hates God's people. It's pure demonic, satanic hatred of everything good. There won't need to be any other explanation, right? It'll be sport in society to kill Christians, to persecute Christians. That's going to be what happens in the future. You read the book of Revelation to see that. What characterizes a situation where civil government, where the laws of the land are running counter to the laws of God? Well, just as happened here in Acts chapters 4 and 5, we're talking about open and overt rebellion against biblical statutes and commandments and principles of God. Right? Now our government is doing this little by little. They don't all change at once, but little by little it is changing. The basis for our whole judicial system, our whole educational system is being changed one law at a time, one act at a time. The foundation is being laid today. It has been for years. And sooner or later, the government is going to start applying those laws. Applying those laws. And when it starts to do that, then you have a situation where Christians are in a no-win situation in society. All right? It's either go God's way or you go the world's way. There's no compromise then. It's not possible to compromise. It's one or the other. There have been a number of instances in the Scriptures where this was done. We all know the story of Daniel, right? Daniel was in one of these no-compromise situations. He was a slave of the king in Babylon with his friends, right? He was in a foreign country, and the king said, eat meat that's been offered to idols, and be strong so I can train you to take over the government here. And that's what they were doing. They were in political training, right? For a godly Jew, he wasn't supposed to eat stuff like that, according to the explicit commandments in the book of Leviticus. I mean, based on God's word. God's law said this, the king said this. Hey, what's Daniel going to do? Daniel said, can we try an experiment, sir? You know, let's try an alternative. You know, that was a wonderful way to approach it. And they said, okay. See? But there was another time when his friends, when they were all put in a situation, I don't know where Daniel was, maybe he wasn't in the capital city where it happened, but his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were all there. Everybody was told, when you hear the music, get down on your knees and worship that golden image up there. The king's golden image, right? When the music played, all the bums went up and the heads went down. There were three Jews standing there with their heads up in the air. Right? Not possible. You can't go halfway down. You can't stay halfway up. Right? It's either or. And you read Daniel chapter 3 for this story, and these men said, O king, you know, we're law-abiding people, but we cannot do what you told us to do. Right? We have to obey God. You read it. And so we're not talking about a situation where, like at present, you know, I think it's important that I set the parameters here. I don't want you all to go out there and start breaking government windows this afternoon. That's not what I'm advocating at all. That's not what we're describing. Our government isn't today forcing us to do wrong, is it? If the government passed a law, for example, that forbade men and women to have more than one child. And now they did that in China. It's in operation today, right? You can have 2 kids in China, I think, right? If they did that, then I would be obligated, maybe not me, I've already got my quiver full, but some of you people might be obligated to follow God's law, right? Instead of man's law. That's mandated. You haven't got a choice then, right? When they tell us that it's wrong to speak out against sin in this country, well, I'll be breaking the law. I'm going to go ahead and break the law. I don't have to be stupid about it, but you know, I'm not going to give up God's law for man's law when there's a conflict. Right? When they pass a law in this country that says you can't tell anybody about the gospel of Jesus Christ, you can't preach the Bible, What are you going to do? That's what we're talking about. That is the parameters of a situation where civil disobedience is necessary on the part of God's people who are obligated to obey government. Richard Wurmbrand says in this book that as soon as a government starts to persecute God's people, they have forfeited their right to be obeyed. Because Romans 13 says that government exists to persecute evil and to bless good. And when government switches those two, who do you obey? The government or God? Should be obvious. And so when Christians are persecuted by civil government, it's going to be an open thing. The choices are going to be black and white. You're going to be arrested like these people were. You're going to be incarcerated like these people were. You're going to be put on trial like these people were. You're going to be prohibited from preaching like these people were. You're going to be threatened like these people were. The government is going to want to punish you. It says that in chapter 4, verse 21. They were looking for a way to punish these Christians. Ultimately, it will result in physical abuse. Now, what is a Christian to do? We're running out of time. What should be the Christian response in such a situation? Look at it with me, please. 4:8. Chapter 4, verse 8. I would like to suggest first that the only proper response of a Christian in a situation like this is to make sure you ask for and put yourself in a situation where you get filled with the Holy Spirit. There's only one way to handle it, right? This is the government against God, and therefore government against you because you're God's. So you better make sure that you've got God's power on your side. It's very possible to be a Christian without God's power. Did you know that? Not that it's not available to you, but you're not appropriating it. That you're blocking it. Right? That's right. And Peter was filled with the Holy Spirit. And it says that again in chapter 4, verse 31. These people prayed and they asked God for boldness and for power. They needed it. These early Christians realized that this is a superhuman thing. In my own strength, I don't know if I could do what Richard Wurmbrand did. I doubt it. He tells a story in here about a fellow prisoner who stayed faithful to the Lord even though they brought his son into his cell and killed him in front of that man. They beat him to death with a baseball bat. The man lost his mind, but he didn't renounce his faith. And nobody can do that in your own strength. Right? That's the worst case scenario. All right, chapter 4, verses 9 to 12. I think if there's anything we could take out of Peter's standing up in court and having to answer for what he was doing, first, we learned that if you're going to win, if you're going to survive as a Christian, you have to be filled with the Spirit. Second, you have to use the opportunities that God gives to you, and they'll be unique to you. Not everybody will go through the same thing, but we need to use the opportunity to boldly preach Christ. That's what Peter did. They were saying, by what name are you preaching? And Peter said, well, you asked for it. There is no other name under heaven except Jesus Christ, whom you people killed. You know, and he pointed the finger right at them. Right? Right? Preach Christ. And that's something that comes all the way through this passage. Chapter 5, the next episode, they were in jail because they were preaching. And the angel let them out and said, run away and hide. Is that what the angel said? 5:20. Go, stand, speak in the temple to the people all the words of this life. And when they heard that, they entered and they taught. All right? Chapter 5, verse 42. After this thing was all done, they let the apostles go after they beat them. And it says, daily in the temple and in every house they cease not to teach and to preach Jesus Christ. You know, if there's one thing the devil isn't going to want to hear, and he doesn't want his people to hear, it's the truth.